what is the longevity of an Uber driver and a Lyft driver? If you start driving, how long in terms of that entire career path does someone continue driving? This is another kind of like open-ended, unedited, raw video because I've done a few of these already, right? There's been a lot of unique things going on in the ride-sharing world, and I think just overall, and I gotta be blunt, I've seen things getting worse and worse. And I gotta be honest too, I don't want to make my videos pessimistic. I don't like being somebody on YouTube, and we see this a lot, that's like a clickbaity title, and something like, this is why I hate bananas and I'll never eat another banana. And it's like, all right, some guy just ranting about whatever. The hard part though is in the ride-sharing world, there has been a lot of more and more and more negative information coming about. I mean, over and over and over again. And I think what's tough is I want to make videos that are very transparent and honest about ride-sharing, right? I don't want it to pretend like these issues don't exist. At the same time, I don't want to make my videos all ranting and everything, but this is a video I do want to do because it is really, really interesting to see. Because if you think about it, when it comes to rideshare driving, I mean, everyone's going to have a different perspective on this, so I'm just giving my own perspective, of course. I think that overall, it's not the type of thing people look into long term, at least I'd assume, right? I think for a lot of drivers, they're like, all right, I want some side cash on a Friday or Saturday night. I want to save up for a vacation. I want to put money into my savings. I want to just have more money for whatever the use is. And of course, as we all know, because it's a flexible schedule, it is a bit easier for you to be able to work around your other schedules and around your other obligations. But it is an interesting thing to see because in the beginning, when I first started driving in 2014-ish / 2015, it was very interesting talking to other drivers. During that time, drivers were making a good amount of money, and I've mentioned this before, I made excellent money, especially, and this was kind of the perfect storm, both literally and figuratively. In Boston, when it would snow, I could make 60 an hour. Pretty, I wouldn't say super consistently, but even if it wasn't 60 an hour, still 40 an hour, which is pretty high. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous if you think about it. Of course, I do consider this the kind of glory days of Uber and Lyft, because the reason why is because of investors backing Uber and Lyft. The rides were cheap for a lot of people to take, and the drivers were making a lot of money. It was a win-win for everybody except the investors. And this is something I will talk about in a second. But during that period of time, it was great. And I remember talking to a lot of drivers who say, hey, I'm never going to do anything else ever again. I'm going to drive full time forever because all the benefits we know. I can drive however I want, when I want. I get to spend more time with my kids. If my daughter has a play I want to go to, I don't have to ask my boss for time off. If, let's say, one day I wake up and my kid is sick, I can just stay home with them and I don't have to ask my boss for the day off or whatever. There is a lot of benefits to it, especially, and I mentioned this before, instant cash outs, right? You can work, make $100, hit a button, boom, that money is in your bank account. Another big thing, which is very underrated, you can work as much as you want. I think right now the law, depending on the state, typically it's you can work max 12 hours a day. But I mean, if you think about it, I remember when I used to bartend, other bartenders would say, hey, is there any way I can pick up an extra shift? And the boss would be like, sorry, can't fit you in the schedule. Everything's already booked. Sorry. And that person, even though they wanted to work, was not able to work. With Uber and Lyft, you pretty much never have to worry about that, right? So there are a lot of benefits, of course, and those definitely do not go unnoticed or overlooked. However, I think over time, I've noticed that in the beginning, when a lot of drivers were like, oh, I'm gonna drive full time forever, all these benefits that I mentioned, over time, a lot of drivers are like, oh yeah, I'm only gonna drive for a year and then pick up something else. I'm only gonna drive part-time because full-time is not worth it. And I think the perspective of the timeline of a driver, of the longevity of a driver, which before used to be pretty much, some people would say, hey, I'm gonna drive forever, right, type thing. You're gonna drive for a long time. Now it's dwindled a lot more. I remember, for example, which is still a bit mind-blowing to me, that I heard about a neuroscientist who started driving for Uber and Lyft because they preferred it more than neuroscience. And I'm like, hey, to each his own. But I remember thinking, like, that's kind of ridiculous. And I feel like neuroscience is I don't know, I'm not a neuroscientist, but like a bit more of a reliable career than Uber and Lyft. And I don't know what they're doing now, who knows, but over the years, this is something I've seen gotten a lot worse. And a lot of drivers have complained about this. Pay rates have gotten a lot worse. I've talked about the algorithmic data discrimination that's been taking place with Uber and Lyft because they're independent contractors. If you have two drivers doing the same exact ride, they can decide to pay one driver more or less than the other driver, just because they feel like it. I've talked before about deactivation. This is another big issue that seems like almost is getting worse, because if, let's say, there's a dispute between a passenger and a driver, typically Uber and Lyft will favor the passenger, deactivate the driver. And for a lot of drivers I've talked to who have been deactivated, they're like, I'm worried. Every single time I'm driving now, I'm worried if, let's say, I'm gonna wake up, I get ready to drive, and boom, it says, sorry, you can't drive anymore. Your account has been deactivated. And let's say you're relying on Uber and Lyft to, let's say, make ends meet, put food on the table. Even if, let's say, you're only deactivated for 2 weeks and they reactivate your account, one, you're like, great, I just lost 2 weeks of work. But two, that almost mini anxiety will probably always be in the back of your head is, what happens if this happens again? And it could easily happen again. And can I even rely on being an Uber and Lyft driver? I was just reading another article about Uber Eats drivers, for example, and I think Uber Eats and Uber are very closely related, of course, but a lot of delivery drivers are saying, hey, now, I'm refusing a lot of trips because delivery driving, I think there's a lot more logistics compared to Uber and Lyft, and a lot of delivery drivers are saying, hey, if you're not paying like 20% or more, I don't even want to drive for you. And that's understandable, of course, right? Tipping is always important for both Uber Eats and Uber. But a big thing is drivers, both delivery drivers and rideshare drivers, are not being compensated the way they were before. And this brings up the whole investor issue, like I briefly touched upon a little bit ago earlier in this video. Because back in the day, and I think most people know this, but I might as well say it in a very simplistic way. Back in the day, investors, I'm making this up, investors, let's say if I'm an investor, I give a bunch of money to Uber and Lyft, and I say, hey, make your rides cheap. I'm gonna take money out of my own pocket, put it into the funds of Uber and Lyft, make your rides cheap, pay the drivers well. Everybody wins, except the investors in a sense. However, over time, a lot of investors have said, hey, we've been losing money every year, right? Because we're just giving money. Now I want you to charge people how they have to actually be charged. And we probably all witnessed this, right? I mean, years ago, I remember here in LA, for example, being able to take an Uber or Lyft for like 12 or 15 bucks, 45 minutes, which is pretty ridiculous. Now it's almost like $15 to go 10 or 20 minutes down the street. Things have gotten consistently worse when it comes to this whole financial aspect of both Uber and Lyft. And I think that's just like a tricky thing. And then overall, you look at this, a lot of investors are saying, hey, we're not going to put money now into Uber and Lyft anymore, although they still are, but we're not going to kind of cover that gap, if that makes sense, of how much a ride actually should cost and how much actually people are spending. And then overall, when you look at this gap decreasing, now pretty much doesn't exist anymore. So you see a lot of people now saying, wow, I'm spending way more money for Ubers and Lyfts than ever before. And then a lot of drivers are saying, wow, I'm making way less money than ever before. And then when you combine the whole tipping aspect, like I just mentioned, in terms of delivery driving, rideshare driving, etc., well, if you think about it, if let's say you're going to take a $15 ride to go 45 minutes, you might tip a lot more than, let's say, if that same ride is $30 or $35, right? I mean, it makes sense for most people, especially with the economy not being that well or not doing that well at all right now. That is a huge thing that if people are like, well, if it's going to cost this much money and then I'm going to have to shell out all this money for rides, I might not be able to even afford a tip, which is kind of tricky because there are a lot of people, especially now with Uber and Lyft being such a staple in our society, there are a lot of people who rely on both Ubers and Lyfts to get to work. If you need to just run errands, whatever the case is. So all these different factors, all these different things I'm kind of touching upon all relate to the longevity of a driver. And what's really interesting to see is the lifetime cycle of a driver seems to be getting less and less and less. That a lot of people are like, yeah, I drove for 6 months, realized it wasn't worth it. I drove for a year, realized it wasn't worth it. And yes, there are drivers who are like, oh yeah, I'm driving for 5 years and I love it. And there are a lot of drivers, don't get me wrong, who are making insane amounts of money. I'm not going to sugarcoat that because I think for a lot of drivers out there, and I've mentioned this before in other videos, it seems like 20 or 25% of drivers are making actually extremely good money, more money than years ago. And then about 75 to 80% of drivers are making significantly less. And this is where you see this huge polar opposite in terms of responses. If you look at the comments on my channel on a lot of my videos, about 80% of them are negative towards Uber and Lyft, and about 20% are extremely and unbelievably positive towards Uber and Lyft. And this is something that's very just kind of unique to see this landscape, but I feel like this kind of polarizing aspect is getting more and more polarizing, where I'm not really seeing as much people being like, Uber and Lyft's good. I very rarely see that, if ever. I think back in the day, people were like, yeah, it's not perfect, but I don't hate it and whatever. I feel like I see very little people in the middle now, right? And I think just, again, as time is going on, I think the longevity of a driver is getting way worse. Like I said, the deactivation, the pay that you're getting, the liability now is getting worse. A lot of insurance companies are now getting more aggressive. And I think that's a little bit understandable, I will say, and that's why I always suggest have rideshare insurance. But then you have these weird things with a dispute between a passenger and a driver that are happening more frequently. And of course, it's always the driver's fault. They're just all these little things that are coming into play. They're getting worse and worse and worse. Well, a lot of drivers are saying, hey, I was going to drive maybe for the next 5 or 10 years because I really like this. I don't think it's worth it at all anymore. And just there's really no point to. And I can see that, especially as things have been continuing to get worse and not even getting better. And I feel like just every month I'm seeing another news article about something bad happening with Uber and Lyft drivers, about the pay, the insurance, the legality, the logistics, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, some of them are clickbaity, right? Because if I say, and you can probably see this on my channel, I've done videos where I'm like, here are 5 reasons why you should drive for Uber and Lyft that make it amazing. That video does not do as well than if I say, here are 5 reasons why you shouldn't drive for Uber and Lyft. The shouldn't versus the should. The shouldn't will get significantly more views. This is something that every YouTuber knows. Like I mentioned earlier, if I was gonna do a video about oranges and bananas, if I said, I prefer oranges over bananas, no one's gonna watch that. But if I said, I hate bananas, I will never have a single banana ever again, and here's why, people are like, tell me more, right? So I will say these negative clickbaity articles do get more attention than not, but just overall, I think this just demonstrates that the longevity of the driver, the kind of lifetime cycle of a driver has been shortening every single year, where a lot of drivers are just saying, look, it's just not as worth it anymore. I'd much rather do something completely different, because after driving for such a short period of time, I realized all the negative aspects of driving. And what's tough is unless something changes with Uber and Lyft, whether it's all the different aspects I talked about, the financial, the logistics, the legal aspects, et cetera, I think the lifetime cycle and the longevity of a driver is going to get even shorter.